Okay, before we get into this one, I want you to actually sit with the question for a second, because it's the kind of question that sounds simple and then quietly eats candidates alive. Here it is. OpenAI's API business sells to companies that are building products that compete directly with ChatGPT. Should OpenAI keep selling to them? Yes or no? Now, most candidates hear that and immediately pick a side, and that's exactly the trap, because the question is not really asking you to vote, it's asking you to think. The answer you're about to hear scored a 4.3 out of 5, and as you listen, I want you to pay attention to three things specifically. 1. Does the candidate accept the question as it's framed, or do they push on the frame itself? 2. When they talk about OpenAI's moat, do they get specific, or do they wave their hands and say something like differentiation matters? And 3. When the trade-off finally shows up, is it a real trade-off, or is it one of those mushy middle ground answers that tries to make everyone happy? One quick thing before we start. If you want to see the actual scorecard hiring managers use when they're sitting across from you in a PM interview, I put together a free video and a one-page rubric that walks you through it on a real question. The link is in the description. Go grab it. It's the fastest way to understand what's actually being scored when you open your mouth. All right, here we go.
OpenAI's API business serves companies that are building products that compete with ChatGPT. Should OpenAI continue selling to them?
Before I take a position, I'd like to establish a shared definition of what we're actually talking about, because I think the answer depends heavily on it. When we say the API, I don't think we're referring to a single product. I think we're referring to a stack. At the bottom, there's base inference, essentially raw model access for generation, classification, summarization. And then layered above that, there's a more sophisticated set of capabilities. Agents, persistent memory, tool use, advanced fine-tuning, evaluation infrastructure. Those are two very different products with two very different competitive dynamics. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to answer this by first locating where OpenAI's moat actually sits across that stack, and then deriving the access policy from there. Because I think a uniform answer, sell to everyone or sell to no one, ends up being strategically blunt in either direction.
That's a reasonable framing. Let's go there. Where do you think the moat sits today?
My view is that base inference is not a durable moat, and I don't think it will be one for much longer. The gap between frontier models on general-purpose tasks is compressing. Anthropic, Google, and a handful of strong open-source models are all converging on credible quality for the majority of standard use cases. So if OpenAI's strategic response to competitive pressure is to restrict API access at that layer in order to protect ChatGPT, I'd argue that's solving the wrong problem. It doesn't neutralize competition, it accelerates developer migration to alternatives and shrinks OpenAI's own ecosystem in the process.
So at the base layer, you'd continue serving competitors.
Yes, I would. I'd keep base inference broadly available through the API. The logic is straightforward. If a layer is structurally commoditizing, attempting to lock it up creates friction without creating defensibility. And by remaining open at that layer, OpenAI continues to capture volume, usage data, developer mindshare, and distribution. Those are meaningful assets even in a scenario where some of those customers are building products that overlap with ChatGPT. Where I'd be significantly more careful is one layer up. That's where I think a real moat exists, and that's where I think access policy should look very different.
Let's go deeper on that. Define that layer precisely.
I'd call it the compound capability layer. These are capabilities that are not purely a function of model quality in isolation. They depend on systems engineering, reliability infrastructure, orchestration logic, and learning loops from real production deployments. Concretely, I'm thinking about things like robust agent frameworks, persistent memory that works at scale, multi-step tool use that doesn't fall over in edge cases, and high-quality evaluation pipelines. The strategic point is that a competitor can acquire a strong base model relatively quickly. They can train one, license one, or fine-tune an open-source model. What's substantially harder to replicate is a production-grade agent system or a memory product that has been hardened through real-world usage over several years. So if OpenAI ships that layer through the API on the same timeline with the same openness as base inference, the company is effectively giving away the part of the stock that actually deserves protection.
So the recommendation is not to stop selling. It's to differentiate access by layer.
Correct. Segment the stock and gate the frontier. Base inference remains broadly accessible because openness there strengthens the ecosystem and preserves scale advantages. The compound capability layer moves behind a time-delayed access model. New frontier capabilities launch first inside ChatGPT and potentially inside select enterprise channels, and then become available through the general API after a defined exclusivity window.
What exclusivity window are you proposing, and how did you arrive at it?
I'd start with 6 to 9 months, and I can explain the logic. 6 months is long enough for ChatGPT to establish itself as the first point of availability for a new capability, which creates genuine product differentiation and meaningful first-party monetization. 9 months is roughly the upper bound before developers begin to perceive the platform as unreliable or extractive. Beyond that, you start damaging the developer relationship in ways that are hard to repair.
But why not permanent exclusivity? If the compound capability layer is as important as you're describing, why release it at all?
2 reasons, and I think both are material. The first is platform trust. If developers come to believe that OpenAI's operating principle is that the best capabilities will always be retained for first-party products, they will begin hedging. They will build abstraction layers over multiple providers. They will reduce strategic dependence on OpenAI. That's not a failure you see in a quarter. It's a slow erosion of platform position over 12 to 18 months, and by the time it's visible in the metrics, it's difficult to reverse. The second reason is regulatory posture. As OpenAI's market position strengthens, permanently withholding frontier capabilities from downstream competitors while operating a dominant consumer product looks very different to a regulator than a time-based release window does. A delay is a defensible commercial decision. A permanent wall starts to look like something else entirely.
So the conscious trade-off is delayed access in exchange for preserved platform trust and reduced regulatory exposure.
That's the trade-off, and I think it's the right one. OpenAI gets a protected window in which ChatGPT can monetize frontier capabilities and build a differentiated consumer experience. The ecosystem still eventually receives access. OpenAI gets to operate as a consumer product company where differentiation matters, and as a platform where openness actually strengthens the business. I don't think those two postures are in conflict if the policy is designed carefully.
Okay, tell me, what's the biggest execution risk in this strategy? Because on paper, it's coherent, but strategy rarely survives contact with distribution realities.
The most significant risk by a wide margin is the Microsoft partnership, specifically Azure OpenAI. If OpenAI establishes a 6-month exclusivity window on a new capability, but an effectively equivalent version is reaching the market through Azure on day 1, the policy is unenforceable. The company is attempting to create scarcity with actually controlling supply. So before I'd present this strategy to leadership with confidence, the first question I'd want resolved is whether those exclusivity windows are contractually negotiable and operationally enforceable across OpenAI's major distribution channels. If the answer is no, the strategy needs to be reconsidered, because designing a release policy you cannot enforce is worse than having no policy at all. It creates the illusion of protection without the substance.
Suppose leadership is open to the approach. How would you validate that the line is being drawn at the right layer, rather than at a layer that simply sounds strategically important?
I'd propose 2 validation tests running in parallel on each side of the business. On the API side, I take a cohort of approximately 50 high-value customers, the ones already building production-grade applications on the platform, and offer the gated compound capability layer as a premium tier priced at roughly 2 times base inference pricing. The opt-in rate within the first 60 days becomes the signal. If a meaningful percentage of that cohort converts quickly, it indicates that the gated layer is creating real economic value for serious builders, not just internal excitement. On the ChatGPT side, I'd measure whether the exclusivity window is actually producing consumer product differentiation. When a new capability launches first inside ChatGPT, I track repeat engagement and retention specifically on that feature. If users try it once and don't return, the exclusivity window isn't protecting anything strategically meaningful. It's protecting a capability that wasn't differentiating to begin with, and the segmentation logic would need to be revisited.
And over the longer term, what's the single metric you'd anchor leadership to?
Capability gap duration. The number of months OpenAI maintains a lead on the compound capability layer relative to the nearest credible alternative. That metric captures what the strategy is actually buying, which is time. If OpenAI can consistently hold a meaningful lead window on higher-order capabilities, the segmentation is working as designed. If that gap compresses quickly, either the moat was misidentified or the company isn't converting its structural advantages into product distance fast enough. Either way, it would be a signal to re-examine the strategy rather than double down on it.
All right, can you summarize the recommendation?
OpenAI should continue selling to competitors, but not on uniform terms across the stock. Base inference remains broadly available because restricting it does not protect ChatGPT in any durable way and accelerates ecosystem fragmentation. The compound capability layer moves behind a 6 to 9 month exclusivity window because that's where the real moat exists, and that's where ChatGPT has legitimate strategic claim to first access. The trade-off is delayed access rather than permanent exclusion, and the entire policy is contingent on enforceable across distribution partners, with Azure being the primary open question.
Okay, let me tell you why this lands at a 4.3 out of 5, and more importantly, what you should actually take away from it. The first thing this candidate does, and this is the move I want you to learn from, is they don't accept the question. They reframe it. But notice how they reframe it. They don't say, I don't think this is a yes or no question. They say, I'd like to establish a shared definition before I take a position. That's the professional version of the same move. It sounds like something you'd actually hear in a real interview room, not something you'd read in a blog post about interview tips. And that single move is what separates a candidate who's reciting strategy from a candidate who's actually doing strategy. Because the question, the way it was asked, has a hidden assumption buried inside it. The assumption is that the API is one thing, and it isn't. And the candidate finds that assumption and pulls on it carefully. That's the unlock. The second thing they do well is they get specific about the moat. And I really want you to hear this, because this is where most answers collapse. A weak candidate will say something like, OpenAI should protect its differentiation, and then move on. That sentence means nothing. It's a placeholder. It's a rubber stamp. The strong version of the answer tells you exactly where the moat lives and exactly where it doesn't. Base inference, commoditizing. Compound capability layer, harder to replicate, grounded in years of systems work. That's not an opinion. That's a thesis. And a thesis is what hiring managers are actually scoring. The third thing, and this is the one that earns the most points in my book, is the trade-off is explicit and it's defended. The candidate doesn't say, well, balance both. They say, I'm choosing delayed access over permanent exclusion, and here is exactly why. Platform trust erosion on a 12 to 18-month horizon, regulatory posture. Those are real, nameable reasons. They're not vibes. And when you can name the cost of your own recommendation out loud before the interviewer has to ask for it, that tells the interviewer you've actually pressure tested your own thinking. There's also a moment I want you to notice that a lot of candidates miss entirely. When the interviewer asks about execution risk, the candidate doesn't pretend the strategy is bulletproof. They bring up Azure on their own. They say essentially, this whole thing depends on whether the exclusivity window is enforceable across distribution, and if it isn't, the strategy doesn't work. That's the voice of someone who has actually thought about what happens on day 2 of the rollout, not just day 1. Now here's the one failure moment this answer narrowly avoids, and this is the thing I want you to walk away with. When a question gives you 2 options, the average candidate picks 1. The strong candidate questions whether those are really the only 2 options. Because in this case, the question was not really yes or no, sell to competitors. The real question underneath was, where does OpenAI's moat actually live, and how should the company's go-to-market strategy change based on that? That's the question. And until you learn to find the question underneath the question, you're going to keep giving structured-sounding answers that score in the middle of the rubric, because you're answering the literal words instead of the actual decision being asked about. So the lesson, the one thing to take from this episode, when a binary question shows up in your interview, your first move is not to pick a side. Your first move is to establish a shared definition of the terms, and then decide whether the question is really binary once those terms are on the table. Most of the time, once you do that work, it isn't. And the candidates who notice that are the ones who walk out with offers. That is why this answer earns a 4.3. Now, tell me in the comments, when you heard, should OpenAI keep selling to competitors, yes or no, did you pick a side in the first 3 seconds? Be honest, I read every reply. All right, if this was useful to you, the best next step you can take right now is to grab the free scorecard I mentioned at the top of this video. It is the same scoring rubric I am using to grade the answer you just heard. There is a short video that walks through it on a real PM interview question and a 1-page PDF you can keep next to you while you practice. The link is right below this video in the description. Go get it. Use it on your next interview. You will start hearing your own answers differently within about a day. I will see you in the next one.